And Prime Minister Netanyahu has again promoted his controversial vision for Gaza, saying that the population could, as he says, voluntarily relocate out of the territory. Palestinians and human rights groups fear that plan could amount to forced displacement. Rights groups are meanwhile raising concerns about another relocation plan that Israeli media says has been outlined by the country's defense minister.
This is Rafah, tents among rubble. The site that Israel's defense minister proposed to place a so-called humanitarian city. It would initially house 600,000 people, then over time, all of Gaza's 2 million residents. They would be searched on their way in and not allowed back out afterwards. Gaza was already one of the most densely populated areas in the world. Since the beginning of the war, Israel has pushed Gazans into less and less space. First came so-called buffer zones, occupied by the military supposedly to keep Israel safe from militant attacks. Israel took control of the Philadelphia corridor in the south along the border with Egypt, and then occupied 2 more corridors, the Morag and Netzarim, cutting Gaza into pieces. Gazans were later told to leave the striped areas marked here, leaving only a small portion of the strip to actually live in. The so-called humanitarian city would be located between the Morag and Philadelphia corridors near the border with Egypt. Human rights advocates have pushed back, saying the plan is a step towards forcing Palestinians out of Gaza, or what the Israeli government has called voluntary migration. No country has publicly said it would be willing to take in Palestinians.
The countries in the region would be under tremendous political pressure not to accept Palestinian refugees from their own domestic populations who would see it as surrendering to Israeli and American wishes.
But Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has leverage in Washington. U.S. President Donald Trump has also spoken of rebuilding Gaza without Palestinians.
Now, relocating Palestinians to another country, packing Gazans into a so-called humanitarian city, how does that stack up with the compatibility in international law? We put that question to Mark Klamberg. He's a professor of international law at Stockholm University.
No, it's not. It would either be a war crime or crime against humanity or both. And this suggestion that it would be voluntary, I think, is not tenable. It would also amount to crime. It's, I would say, impossible to talk about that it would be voluntary under the present circumstances. There is a case law from the Tribunal for former Yugoslavia on similar cases. So it doesn't have to be violence or physical coercion. It can also be taking advantage of a coercive environment. So defendants have been convicted for these type of crimes at the Tribunal of former Yugoslavia. And if you look at also the ICC and the Rome Statute and the supporting documents, it would also be a crime under the Rome Statute. It is possible to move a civilian population temporarily to protect them during a armed conflict, but this is something different. They want to do this on a permanent basis. And we've heard earlier during the spring that they have a policy to expel people from Gaza, and I see this as a part of that. So I think it's impossible to talk about some kind of voluntary relocation under the present circumstances.
And that was Mark Klamberg, professor of international law at Stockholm University. We're going to get even more on this now. We are joined by Rene Wildangel. He is a Middle East expert and a historian based here in Berlin. Israeli officials, for their part, they say that the aim of this plan that we've heard about, reportedly presented by the defense minister, is to separate the civilian population from Hamas. What do you make of the logic behind the plan?
Well, good morning. I don't think that this is the main goal of this plan. As we've heard in your reports, the Israeli government and Israeli Defense Minister Israel Katz has described the so-called humanitarian city very differently. We're basically talking about an internment camp in Rafah, because people under this plan would not be allowed to leave the city of Rafah, which is not a city anymore, which is basically lying in ruins. And then we have this other intention to drive people out. And this is something that has been reiterated by Netanyahu, by President Trump with his Riviera remarks. And this is why everybody, including me, is so worried and is describing it as a potential war crime or crimes against humanity. It's very, very serious and very worrying.
Do you see any chance that it might become a reality, though?
Well, if you would have asked me that question 2 years ago, I might have said no. But unfortunately, in this 20 months of conflict in Gaza, we have seen every red line of international law being crossed. We have seen aid workers bombarded. We have seen refugee camps bombarded. We have seen the complete civilian infrastructure in Gaza destroyed. It is really a very dire situation. Basically, every medic, every humanitarian coming out there right now says that he has not seen anything like it in any other conflict site in the world. So unfortunately, it's not impossible to imagine the worst anymore. And yes, it is a real scenario. And this is why I miss at the moment a clear statement by the EU, because if you see Netanyahu and Trump discussing this in the White House right now, I think we urgently need an alternative to this. We need an alternative that is based on international law and that puts a red line exactly here. Otherwise, yes, unfortunately, I cannot exclude the possibility that this is going to happen.
I want to turn to the talks in Qatar, meanwhile, which are aimed at getting a 60-day ceasefire. The U.S. Special Envoy, we heard a bit earlier, says that he seems optimistic a deal will be done. Do you share that optimism?
Well, I would be relatively optimistic that there will be a deal, but the question is, how does this deal look like? We're talking about 60 days. Now, we had 60 days in March. And that was supposed a 60-day ceasefire with a permanent horizon, with a political solution for Gaza, with an end to this horror that the civilian population is enduring. And in fact, after 2 months, after 60 days, the ceasefire broke apart. So I think this is one of the key points, and this is one of the key points where the Israeli government, where Netanyahu says this is a Hamas demand, a permanent end. Well, I would contradict that this is not a Hamas demand. This is an absolute necessity that we find a final end to this conflict and not another 60-day ceasefire that will then break apart and we will be back at square one again.
Okay, so, I mean, you alluded to it a little bit there, but if we could drill down a little bit into the details, what do you see specifically as the main obstacles to getting a deal done? And how do you gauge the different sides' commitments at this moment in time?
Well, one of the issues, as I said, is a permanent end to the war. And here I have to say it's a little bit difficult because we heard the remarks by Prime Minister Netanyahu, who says, at this point, we need to reach our goals in Gaza, which includes the complete elimination of Hamas. Now, Hamas is the very party he's trying to negotiate with. So this is, I think, one very difficult point. And then there's another key point, which is the humanitarian access. Again, this is now by the Israeli side painted as a demand by Hamas, humanitarian access. No, humanitarian access is not a Hamas demand. It's a requirement by international law. Unfortunately, what we have seen is the creation of this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which has created 4 hubs in the whole Gaza Strip for 2 million people to deliver aid. We've seen killings. Over 400 people have been killed. We have seen a large amount of people being injured. This is a total catastrophe. Humanitarian aid is instrumentalized. And it's a requirement that we need to see the United Nations deliver this aid. They had 400 places within the Gaza Strip to deliver humanitarian aid. Now, this is not a Hamas demand. The international community needs to step up. This is an absolute necessity, absolute requirement. But unfortunately, it's on the negotiating table. This should not be on the negotiating table. This should be a requirement.
We've seen the relationship between Israel and the United States on full display now, in the past 24 hours. And I'd just like to ask you briefly before we go, how much does peace in Gaza hinge now on the involvement and the commitment of the United States? How do you see that relationship influencing the conditions on the ground?
Well, unfortunately, very much, because as we see, it's another deal that President Trump is trying to make, and there seems to be nobody that comes in at this point with an alternative to this kind of deal. And this is why we're not in the realm of international law anymore, but that it basically depends on the negotiating team. And we have heard the plans of the Israeli government when it comes to this humanitarian city, when it comes to expulsion of Palestinians. And this is apparently something that the US is prepared to go along with. Again, we know what Trump said about Gaza, the Riviera remarks, etc. So again, I would like to see the European Union and other major nations to come in here, so we don't depend on Trump's and Witkoff's very personal opinions here, but we come back to a permanent and lasting solution.
Middle East expert Rene Wildangel, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now, with me in the studio is now Rana Abu Farha. She's a Palestinian journalist and talk show host at Ma'an News Network. She lives in Bethlehem. Rana, the Trump administration's messaging is that there will be a ceasefire in Gaza soon, and there's only one sticking point left. Negotiators in Qatar are saying something else. Do you have any information? What's your read?
Thank you for having me, Gerard. First of all, yes, we're expecting a ceasefire according to what comes from Qatar and the US by the end of this weekend. Hopefully, we're sticking to this hope. And yes, there's one point where they are stuck still, and I think it's related to whether it's a permanent ceasefire, an end to the war, or a short-term ceasefire. As we all know that Netanyahu wants only a short-term ceasefire whenever Trump is really working toward ending the war, because ending the war at the end will help him, will help Trump stabilize the region and rebuild the relations in the area, especially with Saudi Arabia, and that's an interest. Even if it was this for us Palestinians, we're still stuck on this hope. And that's what we're hoping. But this is the point where they are not reaching. And there's another point, I think it's one of the risky points at this moment, which is related to Mirage access. They are still debating it and discussing it because Hamas, one of its conditions to approve the ceasefire is that Israel withdraw completely from Gaza Strip whenever this is a point that Israel is still discussing, that they want at least to stay at Mirage access.
Well, Israel has stated repeatedly that it will not accept Hamas government in Gaza any longer. Can you tell us who from the Palestinian side could step in to take over government?
Well, as long as I know, as far as my information, that the Israelis are not accepting at this moment that the PA will take control over Gaza.
That's the Palestinian Authority.
The PA is the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah,
Mm-hmm.
in the West Bank. Yes, this is not accepted to the Israelis, and they've been debating this even in April, last April, and the latest debates. But what I think Israel is now discussing within itself is that Israel could take over the civil control over Gaza within the short term, 60 days, the first step of the ceasefire. That's their plan, which is not approved, and I don't think it will be approved by Hamas, but that's their plan. And then after the 60 days, after Israel secures Gaza and there won't be weapons in Gaza, they would shift it to a third party. The third party, that's the discussion, which is not named yet, which is not discussed, but it's still being, debated in Qatar with Egypt, and Egypt, is pressuring towards having the PA back to Gaza.
Speaking about the PA and the West Bank, there's also the worry, apparently, among many Palestinians that any kind of ceasefire or peace deal will only apply to Gaza. Can you talk to me about that?
Well, it's a huge fear for Palestinians, and it's also a debate whether between politicians and journalists and the community in the West Bank and in Gaza even, that our experiences, our history with Israel, that a war should be open and operations should be held all the time. Whenever we had the ceasefires, the first ceasefire, at the beginning of 2025, we had huge operations held in the West Bank. We had iron gates that were set in front of neighborhoods, between cities, between villages, and we had daily invasions. We had really huge detains and demolitions of the houses, and that's a real fear is now coming back. That's why the debate now in the West Bank that any coming ceasefire should also include the West Bank to guarantee that Israel will not open an operation in the West Bank also.
Now, there have been some suggestions coming out of the Israeli government in the last couple of days. There was the prospect of Gazans leaving the Strip altogether, also a plan to create what they call a humanitarian city where all the displaced people from Gaza would be concentrated in one spot and have access to aid, according to the Israeli government. What do these statements, how are they arriving at the Palestinian community, and what do they do to the negotiations?
Well, to be frankly, I'm in contact each hour, each day with my colleagues, with friends, with family members in Gaza, what the people in Gaza think that they are already existing in one place, pressured in one place, with no food, with no water, with no electricity, with no humanitarian aid, with no access to anything in life. They're like in a room.
But Israel promises that would be better in these new...
We have a history with Israeli promises. We have a history even with the American promises, and we have the latest experience when it comes to the American Association in Humanitarian Aid. We're talking about 100 Palestinian daily shot while trying to receive humanitarian aid. This is an issue. Trust is an issue. Trust is a big issue, real big issue to Palestinians because we have experiences and the war gave us this notice. I do not think that Gazans will just go to these places, will be okay with these choices. But if they had no other choice, that's the reality at the end. And they are not giving any choices.
Thank you very much. Palestinian journalist and talk show host Rana Abu Farha.
Let's get more on all of this. We are joined by correspondent Felix Tamsut, and he is standing by in Jerusalem for us. So, I mean, we heard some optimism from the U.S. Special Envoy a little bit earlier about the potential for a ceasefire deal getting done, but the ongoing mediation talks in Qatar appear to have made little progress so far. Walk us through the main obstacles.
Well, Sarah, we are talking about a situation where U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff explicitly said that out of the four main obstacles, there's only one left. Israeli media report that this issue is involving the humanitarian aid and the form in which the humanitarian aid will enter Gaza. According to Israeli reports, there are suggestions by the Qataris to solve this through an entity which isn't affiliated neither with the U.S. nor with the Palestinians nor with Hamas. People here and media reports here are very optimistic as to the chances of the 60-day truce going through.
Okay, and I mean, let's talk about the Israeli side and all of this, because I mean, you're standing there, you're in Jerusalem. Israel's stated aim is to destroy Hamas. So how sustainable might any ceasefire be, even if they can get Hamas to agree?
That's basically the crux of the issue. Hamas has been demanding U.S. guarantees that the ceasefire will hold and that there will be honest discussions about ending the war. We've had one ceasefire being broken by Israel in March, and this is something that Hamas are not willing to accept anymore. At the same time, it needs to be said that the general feeling among the Israeli public is that both the government and the public here are more wary of the chances of such a ceasefire going through. And I think the comments from the government side show that there is also more willingness to discuss the end of the war, despite the fact that far-right elements from within Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition will try to stand against it.
Netanyahu, and we heard him say it in the soundbite a bit earlier, he said that the relationship between Israel and the United States is the best that it has ever been in his country's 77-year history. What do you think he meant by this?
Well, I would say there are two elements of Benjamin Netanyahu saying this. On the one hand, it cannot be denied that Netanyahu has developed a habit of schmoozing Donald Trump. At the same time, it needs to be said that such quotes by Netanyahu are also about positioning himself as Israel's representative abroad, if you will, as the voice of Israel, as the keeper of Israel's security, and given the fact that opinion polls still position him behind his reported main opponent, Naftali Bennett, who's also a right-wing candidate. This is something that Netanyahu certainly has in mind. And it also needs to be said that when it comes to the Israeli public, they believe that Trump is on their side, and the fact that the US joined Israel in attacking the Iranian nuclear compounds is probably the best evidence of that.
Felix Tamsut in Jerusalem. Thank you.
Thank you.